All right, it looks like we have most everybody in the room, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Spencer Chin, and I'm a sales engineering manager here at Sumo Logic. Just a few housekeeping items before we kick off. We will be sending the recording of the webinar after the session. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the Q&A function on Zoom. I actually have one of my coworkers, Dan Reichert here, who's going to be tackling those questions as we go. If you have any hard questions, you can send them his way. If you have easy ones, you can save those from me at the end. We're going to leave some time at the end of the webinar for a live Q&A as well, and the two of us will answer any burning questions that remain. Feel free to put any ones that pop up in the chat. So in terms of an agenda, first we are going to do a brief introduction to Sumo Logic. And then after that, we're going to hop into the actual demo, and I'll show you our new Kubernetes solution. We're going to show you how you can use the solution to find an issue, identify the problem, and drill down to the root cause extremely quickly. We'll also touch on our app catalog outside the context of Kubernetes, how to search data, how our data collection works, and then we'll go through a second troubleshooting scenario and show you what learning resources are available. Finally, we'll wrap up the session today and answer any questions to remain. So we'll be pretty light on slides today so that we can spend most of the time in the product, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Sumo Logic before we hop in. So who is Sumo Logic? For folks that may not be too familiar with us on the call, we were established in 2010. We're deployed in 8 different regions across 5 continents, and we have over 2,000 customers who use the platform to proactively monitor, troubleshoot, and secure their applications and infrastructure. You can easily send any types of logs and metrics to the Sumo Logic platform, and they instantly become searchable, dashboardable, and alertable. Sumo Logic enables world-class dev, security, and ops teams to accelerate their release cycles, harden their security posture, and maximize uptime for their customers. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop over to the Sumo Logic platform. So this is the Sumo Logic platform, and more specifically, the new Explore tab that was built in conjunction with our new dashboarding framework for our Kubernetes solution. On this left panel, we display all of the different clusters that we're collecting data from. In this case, we just have data for one cluster, which is our prado1.travellogic.info cluster. However, if we had multiple clusters, they would all be displayed here on this left dropdown. What's really nice about this new Explore view is that it's really easy to navigate our cluster through these different entities. And obviously, there are different node namespaces, nodes, services, and deployments within Kubernetes. And sometimes you want to look at your cluster through those different perspectives. So for example, if I pivot over to my node view, when I drill into my cluster, I'm going to see all of the nodes that are running in our cluster. I can then navigate to any of these nodes, see the pods that are scheduled to run on that node, and then the containers in each of those pods. So you can navigate to any of the nodes in your cluster if you're interested in one. So a common scenario is that you receive an alert about a particular node running hot or something. You can click on that node, see all the pods on that node, containers in the pod. And you'll notice that as I'm clicking around in here, the dashboard on the right-hand side refreshes with the data for that given entity. And this is true for any entity listed on the left-hand side. We have pre-built content for every single level of your cluster. So going back up to the node level, you can see that we're presented with metric and log data that is specific to an infrastructure approach to monitoring. This is nice because the things that I care about at a node level are likely different from the things that I care about at a cluster level. So pivoting back up to our cluster view, I'm going to be taken to our cluster overview dashboard. And I'm going to change over to our namespace view because that is the one that is most often.
Hi, Spencer. This is Dan here. It sounds like the audio is cutting out. Are we able to switch over to a different method?
Yep, 1 second. Let me go ahead and switch over so that the audio is less choppy. Give me 1 second, everybody. I apologize for the delay.
So while he's reconnecting onto that, if there was anything in particular that was missed out on, or anyone needs clarification, please throw it into the Q&A or into the chat, and I'll go ahead and clarify it until Spencer joins back in. So question is the percent of cloud versus on-prem. I believe the question is how much of this is on-prem versus how much is in the cloud. So Sumo Logic is fully hosted in AWS. So they're at least on the tool side, there is nothing that you need to host anywhere else for the tool itself. Any other questions or any other clarifications that are needed? So another question was, can you manage on-prem clusters? And the answer is yes, we are able to manage on-prem and cloud clusters. And Spencer can get a little bit more into that later on, but basically, as long as it's Kubernetes, and we can get that collection set up there to pull that data in. Another question is, will you be covering how collectors are configured in Kubernetes? I believe Spencer will be going over that. If not, we could cover that at the end of the call here. Okay, so it looks like Spencer is joining back in now, so let's give it a minute here.
Hey, Dan, I am back now. How is the audio?
It's better for now, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dan, for answering those questions in chat. Everybody feel free to keep putting them in there. So we'll back up a little bit. We're just at our cluster overview dashboard now. And you can see if I navigate to the drop-down here, I have a variety of different dashboards that I can pivot to for this given level in my cluster. So I like to think of the navigation on the left as more of a vertical type of navigation through my cluster, while moving through the different dashboards on any given entity is more of a horizontal type of navigation. So I really like the cluster overview dashboard because I can see a great deal of detail about the things happening in my cluster. So starting with the top, I have a nice honeycomb view of all of the pods running in each namespace and different out-of-the-box KPIs for our namespaces and our pods. So here I see statistics about my namespace, and going down, the one I really like is where I can see my CPU and memory requests versus limits by namespace. This is really helpful just because this is good to set from an operational perspective in Kubernetes.
We do thank everyone here for their patience as we work through everyone around the country and the world joining onto Zoom right now. So Spencer did lose his audio here. All right. So there are. I'll go through some of the other questions that are coming up. Another question was, let's see here. So another question was, do we get the specific logs from pods? Yes, we can get those logs. Basically, anything going to your standard out will be brought in through the collection. Another question is, are the dashboards pre-built? Yes, those dashboards are pre-built. That was what Spencer was going through on here, but basically this is all the dashboards that you're looking at right now. This is pre-built through our through our Kubernetes solution that is just set up through the app catalog. So it should only take a couple seconds to go in there and add it in, and you can get these insights once that data is flowing in. All right. Another question is this full self-service or for any type of configuration, or some requests have to go through support? Yeah, this is typically full self-service. A lot of times we do recommend and ask that you work with us, and we can make sure that things are set up properly and all the data could be properly brought in. But typically, yes, this can be a full self-service deployment. All right, Spencer, are you back on?
I am. We'll try this for the second time. How is the audio now?
It's good. It's good. Thank you.
Okay. I apologize for all the difficulties with our audio situation. Like Dan was saying, I think Zoom is getting a bit overloaded, but we'll try and hop back in now. So let's go ahead and hop back to the cluster overview dashboard. So as I was talking about before, setting your CPU requests and limits appropriately is going to be good just from an operational hygiene perspective, just to make sure that you don't have pods that are consuming more resources than they should, as well as making sure that your cluster is not over provisioned. But at any given level in your cluster, like I was discussing earlier, there may be more than one dashboard that makes sense. So I'm going to pivot over to our Cluster Explorer dashboard as an example. Now, this Cluster Explorer dashboard gives you maybe more of a 10,000-foot view of your cluster versus the Cluster Overview, which is really diving into the specifics. At a high level, this Cluster Explorer is still showing you information about your cluster, but it's abstracted a little. You're seeing the CPU and memory usage for each of your nodes in the cluster. You're seeing relative CPU and memory usage limits by pod in these nice honeycombs here. And then you have more details about the pod memory and CPU down below. So our solution allows you to go as deep as you want into your cluster, whether it's the vertical navigation on the left-hand side or the various dashboards on the right-hand side. So earlier I said we were going to talk about showing you how this dashboarding framework could be used to figure out exactly what's happening in your cluster when you're having an issue. So let's go ahead and pivot back to our cluster overview dashboard to show you how a troubleshooting scenario would work here. So on my cluster overview dashboard, something I notice immediately is that I have a couple pods here in red in my prod loggen namespace. So each honeycomb here represents a pod. Green means things are in a good state. Red indicates something is going wrong. So I'm going to go ahead and drill into that prod loggen namespace so that we can start to do some troubleshooting and figure out what's going on with those pods. So pivoting over to my prod loggen namespace, I'm taken to my namespace overview dashboard. And this is giving me a more detailed look about things that are happening in that specific namespace. So in my pods running by deployment, I can see that I have both a Carbon Black pod as well as a PagerDuty pod that are in the red state. So we're going to focus on the Carbon Black pod for this first troubleshooting scenario. And then a little bit later on in the demo, I'm going to show you how we're going to troubleshoot what's happening with the PagerDuty pod. So because we're focusing on that Carbon Black pod, again, using my Explore tab, I'm going to drill down into that pod level. And so just to reiterate, I think Dan covered this in one of the questions I saw earlier. All of these dashboards are pre-built and out of the box. All I had to do was install my Kubernetes application, and I had access to all of these dashboards to do my troubleshooting. There's nothing that I had to custom build with this. It was all delivered out of the box. So now that we've drilled into the carbon black pod here, my dashboard drills down to my pod overview dashboard, and it's pre-filtered for that specific pod. I didn't have to search or modify anything to see the content specific to that pod. So first off, I see that I have one pod here in crash loop backoff. And I can see a bunch of pod events here that look to be saying it was backoff restarting. So we're going to start to use this dashboard to figure out exactly what's going wrong. Going down here in my pod state, I see that hovering over this, it looks like this pod is in crash loop backoff a bunch. It looks like it briefly goes into a ready state, and then it gets out of memory killed. So it looks like something may be wrong with the memory limits on the container. Luckily, going down to my next section, this is actually taking a look at the resource utilization of this specific pod in my cluster. And scrolling down here, looking at my memory usage versus limits versus requests, I can very clearly see that the working memory of the container is exceeding the limit that we have set. So of course, because it's doing that, Kubernetes is going to terminate that pod, which is the reason that it's in a crash loop backoff. And just to confirm that real quick, down here, the panel that I really like in my containers overview is my containers terminated by reason. And so if we back this up a little bit, look for the last 60 minutes, we're going to see that this pod is indeed getting out of memory killed. So now that we know that the memory limit of the container is set a little bit low, we can go modify that in Kubernetes, and that pod will be able to be scheduled, and it will not be in crash loop backoff anymore. Now, to briefly recap what we did, we used our Explore tab to very quickly drill down from our cluster level to the specific namespace, which was prod loggen, where the pod was having an issue, and then we drilled down to our carbon black pod. We see that with a lot of our customers, they're troubleshooting issues by going into the cluster and running kubectl commands on the pod, or using something like Grafana to visualize their Prometheus metrics, and then flipping into the cluster and running those kubectl commands. But with Sumo Logic, we're able to see everything on one of our easy-to-use dashboards instead of having to drill down into that pod manually.
Hey Spencer, just a clarification. I think it was missed. Could you show again how you showed that the it was out of memory in the dashboard?
Yeah, sure thing. So going back up to here, what I was looking at under my resource utilization section of my pod level dashboard was this panel that's showing my memory usage versus limits versus requests. So the container's working memory is illustrated by this black line. The limit I have set is indicated in red, and the request I have is set in green. So ideally, what we should see as if our limits and requests are set properly is that the working memory should be somewhere between the limit and the request thresholds set here. Instead, I see that this metric, the working memory of that container, is spiking above the limit we have set. So Kubernetes is going to terminate that container. So all that happened here is all we need to simply do is set the limit a bit higher because this container needs a little bit more memory than we were allocating it. So we used our dashboard to very quickly identify this common operational issue. And I believe that was kind of addressing the question around explaining some of the Kubernetes basics for those that are newer to Kubernetes. So if you need illustrations or explanations of anything that I'm saying, feel free to put them in chat. Dan can hop in and I'd be happy to go deeper like we just did. So in summary, without running a single kubectl command, SSHing into our cluster, looking at logs or looking at Grafana, we were able to notice an issue at our cluster level, drill into the namespace for more context, and then find the source of the issue on our pod's dashboard. So now let's move into how to search the raw logs now. The scenario you just mentioned was more of a metrics issue. All of these things were metrics. And so the next question I get from a lot of my customers is, how do we search our logs? Because right now we're just doing a kubectl logs command and pulling out the logs from the pods manually. How would I do that in Sumo Logic? It's important to note that a lot of times with Kubernetes issues, our Explore tab and pre-built dashboards are more than enough to find the issue, like the scenario we just ran through. But I can definitely understand the desire to run some analytics on your logs, or if you need to troubleshoot an issue specifically via the logs. So I'm going to pull up our collection page first. And on our collection page, you can see I'm pre-filtered on that same cluster that we were focusing on for the demo. It's our Prod01 Travel Logic Info Cluster. So with our new Kubernetes solution, we have added the ability to add key value pairs to your logs. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this collector to show you exactly what I mean. So here you can see I've tagged all of the logs coming from my cluster with Prod01 Travel Logic Info. But you can do any freeform tagging that you want of your sources and collectors. For example, common ones are environment. This is our production environment. Perhaps we want to tag this with a team and put in DevOps here. You can add any key value pairs that you would like to make it easier to search your logs in Sumo Logic. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at the logs for this cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new log search here, and we are going to drill in to the Prod01 Travel Logic Info Cluster. And go ahead and type that in. So you can see it's really intuitive to search your logs in Sumo Logic. You don't really have to know much about searching in Sumo Logic. You just have to know, maybe I want logs from this cluster or logs from this specific pod. So since all of the data is tagged with a combination of custom fields and native Kubernetes metadata, you can see and filter by all of those elements in our field browser on the left-hand side. So here you can see we're tagging things like the cluster, the container, the daemon set, the deployment. Those are all native Kubernetes metadata fields that you can use to search on your logs. So say I want to look at logs from my MongoDB pods. I can do something like this, and I can use these wildcards so that I see logs from all of the MongoDB pods rather than a specific one. And I'm going to go ahead and expand my search range a little bit here to the last 60 minutes. So now let's do some basic analytics on this pod. I can see that this pod is giving me messages that it says sent X number of messages to Sumo successfully as log. So maybe I want to figure out, what's the average number of messages that are coming out from MongoDB. The nice thing is in Sumo Logic, I can parse on the fly. This means I don't have to pre-parse any of my data or write things like grok filters. I can parse on the fly at search time for a lot more flexibility. So I'm going to collapse this into more of a flat file format, and we're going to highlight the section we want to parse out. I'm going to go ahead and say I want to parse that selected text, and we'll pull this out as messages. So now, when I run this, you'll see that I have the number of messages available to start doing some analytics on. So let's first figure out how many messages are coming through. So we'll do the average number of messages. And it looks like we have about 28 messages on average. But instead, perhaps I want to see how this is trending over time. So I'm going to slice this into 1-minute chunks, And then I'm going to say, give me the average number of messages in each of those 1-minute buckets. Now that'll build us a nice table, and I can turn that into a bar chart or perhaps a line chart here to see how it's changing over time. And then I could go in and add that to my own custom dashboard. So we'll do average messages over time. And we'll say this is our Kubernetes webinar dashboard. So now we have the start of our own custom analytics dashboard. And in here, I can share that out with other individuals on my team. So perhaps I wanted to share this out with Dan so that he can see the work I did on this webinar. And I have full role-based access control in Sumo Logic, so I can control his level of access as well as the level of access that he can grant others. And we can also link this into our Explore tab if we wanted to, so that when we're navigating our cluster in that Explore tab, this custom dashboard would pop up there as well. So let's go ahead and take a step back for a second. So far, everything we've looked at has been pretty specific to Kubernetes, which is just one of the apps that we have in our out-of-the-box app catalog. This out-of-the-box app catalog, however, contains pre-built content for many other common log and metric sources. So Kubernetes is just one of the many apps that we have in here. And each of these apps has pre-built operational and security-focused content for all of the sources that you see here. The nice thing about these apps is that they are extremely easy to get up and running. If you see an app that you like, once you set up collection for it, like we have for Kubernetes, all I do is click on that app, hit add to library, and then I point it towards the data source. So this is all self-service, and it's installed in just a couple clicks. Specific to Kubernetes, though, we've also partnered with a handful of other companies and products to provide additional security and operational insights into your Kubernetes environment. So on this slide, we have a list of all of the partner applications that we launched in conjunction with our Kubernetes solution. Each of these integrations is supported by a Sumo Logic app that was built by our partners and then brought into our app catalog. So this is the most up-to-date application that you can find for each of these specific technologies, and it was built by the respective vendor, so you know that it's focused on the things that they find are important to monitor in their environment. So now, a question earlier came up about the collection and how that works. So we're going to take another step back and talk about how we are collecting the various logs and metrics from Kubernetes. So going to our Kubernetes data collection slide, I'm just going to go ahead and hop into present view to make it a little bit bigger. We collect log, metric, event, and security data via FluentBit, FluentD, Prometheus, and Falco. Now, these may all be looking familiar to you because they're all open source data collectors that are maintained by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Utilizing these open source tools for collection and data enrichment is ideal for two main reasons. One, these collectors typically receive a lot of community support. And the second is that they typically have integrations for any type of data that you may want to collect. So going a little bit deeper into each of these, we'll start off with our FluentBit daemon set. This is what we use to collect the logs that your pods are sending to standard out or standard error. For the events from your Kubernetes cluster, we have a FluentD deployment that is essentially watching on the API server. For metrics, we use Prometheus. And many of you are familiar with Prometheus already because it is the de facto standard for pulling metrics from Kubernetes. And we use Prometheus because it has really good auto discovery capabilities. Because of those auto discovery capabilities, that Explore tab in Sumo Logic that we were showing earlier is automatically going to stay up to date with the live state of your cluster. So this is really helpful because Kubernetes is so ephemeral. As you have pods and nodes and things of that nature that are coming online or being spun down, that's automatically going to be reflected in the Sumo Logic UI. So it's really helpful, and that's thanks to the auto discovery capabilities of Prometheus. Now, our out-of-the-box collection also runs Falco too, and I like to describe this as a mini SIM for your Kubernetes cluster. It's going to have a rule file that monitors things that are suspicious, things like files being accessed that aren't normally supposed to be accessed, a process spinning up a suspicious job, or things of that nature. Now, all of these collection pieces send their data through this FluentD enrichment pipeline. So as you know, Kubernetes is rich with metadata, and each of these things is a descriptor of how one relates to another. But the problem that Kubernetes presents is that all of these entities aren't always tagged in a consistent manner. So for example, a log may be tagged with the node and the pod and the container it's coming from, while a metric may be tagged in a slightly different manner. The problem that this presents is that it can make it very hard to do cross-signal correlation. You see a metric spiking, and then it can be hard to easily pivot over to the log that is associated with that same metric. Thankfully, our enrichment pipeline ensures that every log, metric, and event is tagged consistently. So you know what container it's from, what pod that container is in, what pod labels are on that pod, what node it's scheduled on, what namespace it's running in, and what cluster it's on. So with the metrics serving as your smoke detector and logs enabling us to drill down to the root cause, unifying those data sources around that common metadata language enables us to easily correlate these signals. We can easily pivot from the metrics data about a cluster to the events data about a cluster to the logs data about an application. So now we're going to hop back into Sumo Logic and show you a troubleshooting scenario that's more focused on logs, and it will show you the power of this common metadata language. So pivoting back over to Sumo Logic, I'm going to hop back into our Explore tab. So we're going to go back up to our cluster level, and we're going to start on our cluster overview again. So again, we see in our prod loggen namespace, we had those two problems. We already figured out what was happening with Carbon Black here, but we need to figure out what's happening with PagerDuty. So because I know that the memory limit was set incorrectly for Carbon Black, I'm going to go ahead and check the same thing for that PagerDuty pod as well. So I quickly drill down from the cluster level to the prod loggen namespace, and then I go to my PagerDuty pod. So going down, I see that, hey, this pod is in crash loop backoff again. I see some backoff restarting messages. It's feeling a lot like the same problem that Carbon Black was having. So I'm going to go straight down to my resource utilization section and take a look at my CPU and memory limits versus memory limits and requests versus the actual usage. But here, I actually see that, hey, my CPU usage is fine and my memory usage is much lower than the limit. So it seems like it's actually a different problem here. So this is a good example of where logs may be helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and drill down into the logs directly from this pod. So going up here, even though this is a metric, because of that common metadata language, I can quickly click on it and say, give me all the logs from that specific pod. And now instead of our metrics, boom, we're taken straight to that PagerDuty pod. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and expand my window just a little bit. And I'm going to say, Actually, you know what? Let's take a look at the logs here because there's not a crazy amount of logs. So we'll see right off the top, I see I have a 401. And I know that 401 means unable to authorize. So it looks like this pod is trying to authorize with our Sumo Logic Collector API, but it's getting denied. So I'm interested in why it's unable to authenticate now. So I'm going to go down a little bit further and see what's going on here. See some invalid cookie headers. See the collector URL that we're trying to reach. And here I see that we're logging an access key and ID here. So it's able to set the access ID and the access key, but then we know it's getting that 401 and it's unable to authenticate it. So I'm going to see if there are any other logs for this access ID. So I'm going to quickly add that to my search. I'm just going to highlight that value, and I'm going to quickly add that as an OR. We'll go ahead and we're going to bump this out to the last 60 minutes to figure out what's going on. So now that we're looking at the last 60 minutes of logs, over in my field browser that we covered earlier, I actually see that there are multiple sources here where that access ID is popping up. And one of them is the Kubernetes source for the PagerDuty pod, which is totally expected. But the other one I see is this labs Sumo Logic source. And that source category is just a piece of metadata that's used to identify where the log came from. And this source category is an internal audit log for Sumo Logic. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and see what's going on in that audit log. Now here, I just have 2 logs, and it looks like we have the reason that we're getting that 401. It looks like a user from our Security Operations Center, Dan Shady, successfully disabled and then deleted this access key that was being used. So I know that Kenneth used to be on my team, but he actually got offboarded. So that's probably why that access key was disabled and then deleted. So to resolve this issue, I'll probably need to go generate my own access ID and key and enter that value in so that that MongoDB pod can, or the PagerDuty pod, excuse me, can use that to authenticate. So you can see that in this scenario, it was still easy to notice the issue from our cluster overview, drill down into the namespace, identify the pod that was having the issue, and then pivot from the metrics into the logs and do that root cause analysis. So we've covered 2 different scenarios today that used our Explore tab to find some Kubernetes specific issues. The first one was that memory limit issue for our Carbon Black pod, and this one was our application issue for the PagerDuty pod. So we're going to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. The only thing I wanted to cover was what learning resources are available to help you get the most out of Sumo Logic. So going back to our Home tab, on our learning page, this has a couple different tutorials as well as some 5-minute quick start videos to help you get up and running with Sumo Logic. But personally, my favorite way to learn Sumo Logic is a more in-depth and hands-on scenario. And for that, we have our completely free and self-service certifications. So when you sign up for a Sumo Logic trial, which I'll give you the link to at the end of the webinar, you have access to all of these certifications, and there are 6 of them as of today. There are ones specifically around metrics with Kubernetes, and it'll walk you through that Explore tab that I demonstrated in today's webinar. The nice thing about these is you can do them at your own pace. We have our own training environment set up that has dummy data flowing in. So you don't need to set up collection for your Kubernetes cluster. You can just log into our training environment, go through these hands-on labs, and then take an exam to get your certification. And once you get your certification, we'll send you some Sumo Logic swag. So that's a little bit of an added incentive to go take these certifications after this webinar. Now, as we wrap up, we're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A, but I wanted to point out a couple of resources that are available to you. So the trial sign-up link can be found here. And we're going to email this out along with the recording of the webinar. So like I said, the best way to see the power of Sumo Logic is to experience it for yourself rather than me telling it to you. So I strongly encourage you to sign up for a 30-day trial, and our team will reach out and get you paired up with a sales engineer like myself or Dan to help you get up and running. We also have a very active public Slack channel that you can sign up for at slack.sumologic.com. It's a great way to connect with Dan and myself, as well as other Sumo Logic users. If you really liked the webinar that I gave, you can contact me in our public Slack channel at Spencer Chin, and I'll have Sumo Logic after my name. My email is also here for any other questions if you want to follow up directly. So now with that, that's all I had for the webinar. I really appreciate all of your time and attendance today. So we'll go ahead and open it up for any other questions that you have in the Q&A. And it looks like Bill just asked a question. Is the webinar recorded and available? Yes, we will be sending out the recording along with all of the resources that are mentioned on this slide. And then it looks like Hyman asked where we can find APIs. So that's actually a great plug for our help docs. If you go to help.sumologic.com, you can find all of the documentation on any of the APIs. That would be like our collector management API that we covered in the troubleshooting scenario, or any of the other various APIs that we use to manage the Sumo Logic platform.
All right, any other questions?
Looks like we have one question on Kafka monitoring. So actually we use Kafka internally at Sumo Logic to power our platform. So Kafka really depends on what metrics and logs you publish for Kafka. Like, we customized our Kafka pipeline to emit a lot of metrics and logs. So there are a lot of different ways that you can bring those into Sumo Logic. If you're running Kafka on Kubernetes and those logs are just going to standard out, standard air, and it emits metrics via Prometheus, then our default collection will pick those up and bring those into Sumo Logic.
All right, and we have another question about the URL for our Slack channel, our Sumo Dojo. Could you remind us again of that, Spencer?
Sure, I'll go ahead and put that in chat for everyone.
All right, are
Go
there
ahead
any differences between AWS and Azure? And I assume that that means for bringing Kubernetes data in.
Yeah, great question. So the only slight difference for any of the managed Kubernetes services is that generally those control plane logs are going to be made available by the service provider themselves. So for AWS, those EKS control plane logs are going to be collected from CloudWatch. In the case of Azure, those AKS control plane logs will come from Azure Monitor. So that's the only difference, is where the logs are collected from for the control plane. Other than that, all of the collection that I mentioned on this slide will work exactly the same. Right. It looks like there is a question on the best way to reach out to us in case of issues during Kubernetes and Sumo integration. You can go ahead and just send an email to myself and I'll get you routed to the appropriate person. If you're already engaged with a member of our sales team, then I would contact them directly and they can set you up with a solutions engineer.
Great. And another question, what is log reduce and log compare features?
Yeah, great question. Let me go ahead and hop back into Sumo Logic to demonstrate that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up another search. We'll quickly clean up everything else. So again, I'm going to go ahead and point us to a source. We'll just say this is going to be our checkout service logs. We have some custom app logs that are actually, you know what, we're going to look at all of our checkout logs for our travel service. So go ahead and look at the last 60 minutes. Now, when you're looking through logs, log reduce and log compare are really valuable when you don't know exactly what you're looking for. So you can see here, we're just looking at a collection of different sources under our production travel logic environment. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit log reduce here. Log reduce is a clustering algorithm that groups log messages together based on their similarities. So rather than seeing hundreds of pages of raw log messages, you're now going to see what we call signatures with a corresponding count. So these are bunches of similar logs, and it makes it really quick to go through a lot of log messages. So in those signatures, anything in an asterisk is a variable part of the message, while anything in static text is something that's not changing from message to message. So instead of going through, 700, 800 pages of logs here, we now just have 2 pages to go through because Sumo Logic is clustering them into those signatures. So what it allows me to do is quickly move past messages that are happening hundreds or even thousands of times here, like all of these info level logs. And it allows me to go drill down and find messages that are more rare in my environment, these messages that are happening only a handful of times. So it's really good for finding the needle in the haystack with any given log message. And log compare is simply a variation of that. So log compare is going to tell you how your environment's fingerprint has changed over time. So it's going to give you a summary of your environment, and you can compare, like, say, a new version of your app to an old version of your app to see if that new version has introduced any anomalies or errors that may not have been there before. So these are 2 really helpful and useful features to help you figure out exactly what's going on in your environment. And you don't have to specify anything in particular. You just point it at a source of data and have Sumo Logic summarize it or tell you how it's changed.
Thanks, Spencer. Any other questions at all? All right, all you, Spencer.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think we will go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you again for your time and attendance today. We'll be sure to get the recording and all of the links that I mentioned sent out to all of you. Have a good day, and it was nice talking to all of you.